So if you have been playing Honkai Star Rail for the past 3 years, you would have most likely encountered a scenario that might be similar to this. This is not by any means a suggestion or an insinuation of a single character, but I think it is not too uncommon for the HSR player base to imagine that, you know what, as long as I E6 a certain unit in Honkai Star Rail, she will never be power crept. And that brings us to essentially the topic of today's video, and that is the E6 situation in HSR. Hey guys, MrPokke. We are going to be trying out a more chill, right, a more casual, right, a more happy, more calm discussion for this type of format, where I kind of want to explore this particular statement in HSR with regards to getting a single character to E6, as well as the reasons why that will never make a character immune to power creep. So without further ado, let's just jump in to first understand why somebody wants to get themselves an E6 character. It mainly just boils down to two things. They either did it because they love their waifus or husbandos, or they did it as this specific individual as an example to prevent power creep, to maximize their strength, to maximize their damage numbers, to maximize their kits, to make them feel absurdly broken at the time of their release, to the point where you would never imagine a E6 unit in HSR being forgotten in the shadows of the tier list. Alright, so for the very first group of people, which is they got themselves an E6 purely due to waifu or husbando reasons, you know what? Slay. Based, right? I think people should be allowed to spend money or spend whatever they want to do as long as it's something they enjoy. So that is not gonna be the main topic of contention today. The main topic is more so towards the people in HSR, which I would now refer to as the meta chasers. Right? You are pooling for multiple copies of a unit, and in this example, an E6 unit, for the purpose of chasing meta, chasing strength, right? Chasing performance, right? So that is the main focus, and why I want to bring up this idea where, you know, you can see from this little tweet by MrPokke, 1 E2 plus 2 E1 is better than 1 E6. Now, the reason why we use this as a comparison for against E6 is because at the end of the day, HSR has this very interesting topic known as the cost system, which you guys might be familiar with a lot of mainstream gacha games, where they will measure a team's value in endgame performances tied to this thing called cost. Now, whether or not cost is gonna be a good or bad metric to judge your performance, that is gonna be a topic for another day. But specifically just for today, since we are focusing on only E6, 1 E2 and 2 E1 is gonna have the exact same cost as a singular E6. Right? It's 7 different 5 stars combined into one. So for this particular instance, I would dare say, right, there is not a single character in the entirety of Honkai Star Rail that will have an E6 which guarantees them a permanent use for the rest of their lives, especially if you do not pull for anything else. That is the most important thing, right? Because in a vacuum, if you just talk about a single E6, fine, right? A single E6, especially on their time of release, and I would dare say for the next maybe a half a year or even 1 year, it is gonna be really strong, right? But you can see that eventually, as the versions for HSR expand, this particular E6, they will also have indirect buffs to them, especially for DPS, in the forms of either new support or a new sustain. And just for today's video, I think we are just gonna be using this particular unit over here as an example, and that is none other than our version 2 anniversary unit, Acheron. Right, so if you guys remember way back in those days, right, way back in version 2 when Acheron first launched, right, everyone was like, oh my god, the E6 Acheron single ultimate dealing 2 million damage, one-shotting the entire wave 1, instantly half-healthing, 60%, 70% healthing the boss, and you basically end the fight in negative AV, right? That was the experience for Acheron way back in the days, and this was before Jiaoqiu was introduced. This was before Jiaoqiu was introduced. And then eventually, as more and more versions came up, right, they also started to introduce indirect or direct upgrades for Acheron. For example, Jiaoqiu, right? For example, Aventurine, right? He might not exactly be an Acheron sustain, but he was the best option back then, right? Eventually, Cypher, right? Cypher was really good. And then we have the reworked Silver Wolf. And if you combine reworked E2 Silver Wolf with Trippy, now Trippy's attacks also deal debuffs. So now at this day and age, Acheron's best in slot team, whether or not you're going to be E0, E2, or E6, it is no longer going to be the same as compared to the initial version of version 2, because you're definitely going to be making use of units such as Cypher, Silver Wolf, Trippy, and now the free DHPT. Alright, so that is the number one of the reasons why I would say no E6 is ever gonna be future-proof, right? Especially for DPS, because it will never stop you from continuously getting other supports and sustains to make that E6 remain relevant. For example, if you want to talk about whether or not this E6 Acheron is gonna be able to function with or without her newer version 3 or maybe even version 4 supports, and you still want to use, like, let's just say, Pella, right? You still want to use like Jiaoqiu, sure, right? They can still clear, right? I'm not saying that E6 Acheron is literally unplayable. They can definitely still clear, but you didn't get E6 Acheron just to clear, right? Nobody gets an E6 Acheron for the sake of 3-starring endgame content, right? They probably got themselves an E6, especially at that point of time, to make it feel like, oh my god, she's unstoppable. She's tier 0, right? She can never be replaced. She's gonna be the strongest DPS on my entire account. If that is the intention of the E6 at the start, you'll find yourself, because you were chasing for meta, right? You were chasing for performance, you still find yourself in a situation where you feel like you need to pull for the Cypher. You feel like you need to pull for the E1 Trippy. You feel like you need to pull for the E2 Reverse Silver Wolf. And maybe who knows what kind of vertical supports or replacement is going to be coming out in version 4, right? So inherently, just in a vacuum, pulling for E6 does not stop you, or rather prevent you from pulling other units purely from the perspective of chasing for their performance, right? So that is going to be the number one reason. Number 2, the second reason why this pulling for E6 just to like get performance is a little bit flawed is because the way that HSR's Eidolon system work in this game, between E0 all the way through E6, you'll notice one very, very common trait for every single unit in HSR, right? If you haven't played this game long enough, you'll probably know what I'm talking about. For those of you guys who don't really know what I'm saying, is that usually, generally speaking, the power scaling for units Eidolons is from E0, that's your baseline, and then you decide whether you get an E1 or an S1, and then you decide if you want to get an E2, because generally speaking, that said E2 will give you quite a big performance. So if you want to talk about like DPS, for example, E2 Phynon, E2 Castris, E2 D-Herda, to a certain extent, you could even say like E2 Aglea, although Aglea is way more important than E1. A lot of these DPSs, they have their early Eidolons giving them a tremendous boost in their performance. But between E2 through E6, the things in the middle, the E3, E4, and E5s, I would dare say there are almost no units in this game where people would intentionally stop at these Eidolons. Because E3 and E5, it is straight up just a +2 level to your skills. And for most units E4, especially in the early days of HSR, their E4s were really, really fucking useless. Alright, they have improved on this in version 3 as well as now in version 4. But back in those days, if you take a look at like the older characters E4, so let's just say for example, one of my favorite E4s of all time, right? Where is bro? The E4 Jiaoqiu. Do you really think somebody is gonna commit 5 cost, that's E4, 5 cost for a E4 Jiaoqiu, giving you a massive 15% attack reduction? Alright, so because of a lot of these units having their eidolons at E3, 4, and 5 being majority of the time very minimal improvements over the actual amount of stellar jades they would have spent, it will greatly diminish the actual value you get out from the E6. Because you don't just instantly pull for an E6. You have to commit for E3, 4, and 5 before you even get to the E6. So if you take this as a comparison to another player who, let's just say, pull for 2 different E1s, right? That 2 E1s would have been 4 costs, which is just 1 more than E3, E4, and E5. So because of the way that this eidolon system is structured, somebody that's pulling for an E6 right out from 0 through 6, you will never have the same level of worth, right? Because stellar jade is always the same. You always spend the same 1600 stellar jade for a single 10 pull, but in terms of whether or not it's worth, are you really going to be spending potentially up to 160 pulls for an E3, for an E4, or for an E5? I don't think so, right? So that is the second reason why pulling for E6s and HSR, it just fundamentally will never make sense if you are going to be someone that's chasing purely just for performance, right? And once again, I need to reiterate, it is not for the waifu husbando chasers and that those who pull for what they want because they want to see their favorite unit being the best they possibly could, right? Because if you have a favorite unit, right? If your waifu was going to be Jiaoqiu, or rather husbando, right? If you're Jingyuan, right? If you're you know, your Aglaya, if your favorite unit is just that one single unit, whether it is because of the lore, the performance, or whatever it's gonna be, then there are no alternatives for this E6. Because that's what you want as a player to have fun, which is completely fair. But my counterpoint is mainly for the players who are just thinking, okay, let's say I want to make my Acheron be the best performing DPS possible. Should I be spending 7 costs for an E6? Or should I just invest 3 costs for an E2 Acheron, 2 costs for an E1 Tribi, and let's just say 2 costs for a E1 DHPT? Alright, I would dare say these costs would still give bro more value than an E3, E4, and E5 before you eventually get into the E6. Right, so that's gonna be my second reason as to why pulling for E6 and HSR just fundamentally doesn't serve a lot of purpose if you're gonna be chasing for meta. And now, I'm gonna jump into my third reason, and that is the actual effect of the E6 themselves. You will notice something that's gonna be happening in HSR from version 1 all the way through to version 4. There's this thing called the Eidolon power creep. Right? It is not just a unit's performance based on their E0 S1, E0 S0, their Lycons, or even their E1s and E2s. Eidolons in this game inherently do not have the same value as the versions of the game improve, right? So I think the greatest example, just simply take a look at a version 1 DPS. For example, let's just say Jingyuan, right? Jingyuan's E6, see here. Each hit will make the enemy vulnerable, and it will receive 12% more damage until the end of the Lightning Lord's turn, stacking up to 3 times. For an entire E6, you are gonna be getting up to 3 stacks of a vulnerability that goes away the moment Lightning Lord ends. You are literally gonna be spending 7 costs for an effect that doesn't even last until the Lightning Lord goes away. This is a version 1.0 E6, right? Now, this might seem like a little bit of an extreme example because bro does not even have rare spend. So let's just take a look at a version 2 E6, none other than the unit in contention right here, Acheron. From version 2 and to a certain extent even some version 1 main push, for example, E6 deals, his E6 does come with imaginary respan, right? I think for most DPSs, we can all agree, if you are gonna be having imaginary respan or any forms of respan, that would generally mean that their eidolons are pretty decent, because this is like a classic phenomenon for most E6. But if you just take a look at Acheron's E6, right? 20% respan. Fantastic. Okay, the secondary effect of her E6, the damage dealt by your basic and skill will also be ultimate energy and can reduce enemy toughness regardless of weakness type. When breaking weakness, you will trigger the lightning weakness break effect. Lightning weakness break, guys. Wow. For a whole ass 7 cost Acheron, the effects of this E6, aside from the 20% respan, is that you get to trigger a lightning weakness break regardless of the enemy's element typing. So unless you are gonna be saying, okay, you know what, this is actually meta for Dotcaron, because now Kafka can trigger my lightning weakness break, why is this the actual effect of our E6? This is not an E1, this is not an E2, this is a whole ass E6. Alright, so I hope that you guys can kind of see like the example. Although this is definitely gonna be considered better than, let's just say, for example, Jingyuan, which is a version 1 E6. Now let's take a look at a version 3 E6. Let's just Aglaia, right? Because these three are all their respective versions lightning DPS. Version 1 lightning, version 2 lightning, and now version 3 lightning Aglaia. Her E6 gives you 20% respan and up to a 60% increment in your joint attack damage. And considering the amount of times your Aglaia actually uses this joint attack, it is pretty much 100% uptime. Because ideally, by the time you reach E6 Aglaia, with the addition of E1, you are never ever leaving this ultimate state. Alright, so if you want to talk about the actual value of a singular E6 in combination with the E4s, the E2s, and the E1s, you'll quickly come to realize that at least for DPS characters, right, at least for DPS characters, most units, eidolons, they tend to grow even stronger with the version. And as more and more versions get added to the game, a singular E6, even though you're spending the exact same amount of stellar jades in a vacuum, you are still gonna be getting way more value out of the newer E6 compared to an older E6. And this is just for DPS. Even if you were to talk about, let's just say, for example, supports, right? Let's just use a classic timeless example, and that is gonna be none other than Runmei. Right, Runmei's Eidolons back when she first launched, it was like, oh my god, it's so good, right? You have defense ignore on the E1, you have a 40% attack buff on the E2, crazy, right? And then E4 gives you a 100% break effect, and this E6 help you deal additional break damage from your ultimate talent, as well as extending your ultimate duration. This was Runmei, a support E6 Eidolon, which I think for a lot of players, you will also think that supports don't get power creep, right? Even for support Eidolons themselves, they don't get power creep. Now, fast forward to units like your Sparkle. Okay, you know what? I guess Sparkle is a little bit unfair because she technically just got Nova Flare, so she's definitely a lot better now. But if you want to compare with newer supports, right? For example, like your Sundays, your Bubbins, I can't actually find. Okay, for example, Bubbin will give you a 450% additional damage increase, triggering up to 8 times, on top of pretty much having 100% uptime starting from the E2. And then if you fast forward even more, we have the infamous, one of, if not the most popular support Eidolons in the entire game, the E1 Tribute. This happens in an E1. So even for units like supports, their Eidolons will also face similar situations called the Eidolon power creep, where a singular cost investment will not give you similar results despite spending the same amount, regardless if you are going to be a support as well as DPS. So because of these 3 reasons, I personally just want to circle back here. If you are someone that's going to be looking for this thing, right? Now, a certain unit, it could be Acheron, it could be Jingyuan, it could be Tribute, it could be a certain unit will never be power creep. If your idea of this prevention, right? How do you make this unit last as long as possible? If you think that the solution is simply to pull for an E6, I would say, generally speaking, HSR is a game that greatly incentivizes the lighter spenders, right? Not actual like just light spenders, but lighter spenders going for multiple E1s or E2s instead of going all in for a single E6. And this brings me to my final point, right? This is the final point. And it's actually a little bit sad, right? It's a little bit sad. No matter how much you want a certain unit to try and maintain their relative strength in HSR's meta, there is this one thing that will never ever go with you. And that's the environment. You could give E6, you could give E1s, you could try to play, like, let's just say a follow-up team. You could try to play a elation team, remembrance team, super break, right? No matter how much you want to give themselves the investment, the environments that are designed in Honkai Star Rail, it will never go backwards. It will only go forward to push for the newer units, to make the newer units have a shield environment so that their performance will seem better than they are. And if your older team comps do not belong in the same category as the new rate up, then they're simply not going to perform as well, strictly in terms of performance. Which is why for every single MOC, Pure Vision, A-Point, and even Anomaly Arbitration, it doesn't actually matter if you are looking for a E6 super rate team versus a E0 elation team. Because obviously, the elation team is gonna be fucking clearing better at a lower cost. Okay, we're not gonna talk about the cost system, but that's basically my point, right? No matter how much you want to make that unit perform well in meta, it will never beat the external factors that is the environment. So if you're someone that is chasing meta, number one, it is a pointless task. Because the meta is basically just whatever that is new, whatever that's gonna gain a benefit from the shields, that will always usually be the best performing. For example, right now, Remembrance is still doing very well, right? Remembrance has the full Remembrance flagship that just came out in version 3. Do you really think that your Remembrance flagship will still be the very best, no matter the cost, by the way, right? No matter how much you invest, do you think they will still be the best compared to the Elation flagship of this version when they are going to be introducing more Elation units and more Elation show environments? And if you want to talk about cost, do you think your 8-cost Remembrance is going to have a better or the same performance as an 8-cost Elation? Food for thought, and I think with that, we are pretty much gonna be coming to the end of today's content. The E6 problems in Honkai Star Rail. If you guys are interested in hearing MrPokke rage about the cost system, let me know down in the comments. Word of the day is going to be, she will never be power crept. Iru, for the thumbnail, I want you to use Acheron, sad face, Facial, happy face. And then have an E6 Acheron and an E0 Facial. Thank you, right? Join Twitch, join Discord, join use code POKE for 10% off gamer stuff. All the best for Gacha Fools, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.